I'm Jono Buchanan, and in this video we're going to look at the vintage Mellotron plugin. Now this is actually one of 4 vintage plugins that Apple have made for Logic, and it focuses on one particularly interesting instrument, and that is the Mellotron. Made famous probably by Strawberry Fields Forever more than any other sort of use of that, although Mellotrons have been used on countless records. So it provides the kind of characteristic sort of distant flute sound that we hear at the beginning of Strawberry Fields Forever. And the Mellotron's an amazing instrument because it's almost like a sort of pre-digital sampler. What it allowed people to do was to record sounds onto individual pieces of tape, which were then triggered from keys. So when you pressed a key, the tape started to play back, dragging the sound that had been recorded to that bit of tape across a playhead and producing volume. And then when you released the key, the tape would immediately spool back, effectively resetting so that it could be triggered again. Now, Logic's version of the vintage Mellotron obviously is not tape-based, but what it does is to give us a whole variety of Mellotron-y sounds, which we can then use in interesting ways. Now, what I'm going to do is to bring a Mellotron sound to this kind of basic backing track that I've programmed for one of my favourite drum machine designer kits, which I've used before, which is the Birdland Calls kit, which is here. And you can hear that this is basically a kind of old-school hip-hop loop with some interesting little pitched elements too. Okay, so this is all coming back from one kit, both the drum sounds and the pitched instruments as well. Now to this loop, what I want to do is to add the Mellotron. And to do that, what I'm going to do is to close down the library, which is over here. I'm just showing you the kit is this one in case you want to experiment with this too. Just close this down. And what I'm going to do is to set up a new instrument plugin. By the way, you can do that simply by just double clicking in the empty space. You don't have to go via the plus button if you want to. And what I'm then going to do is just sort of close down the piano roll display, and we will assign the vintage Mellotron, which is down here in this group of 4 vintage instruments towards the bottom of Logic's plugin list. Now it's a mono instrument, it's not available in stereo. I'm going to just open it up and it looks like this. So what I've effectively got are 2 sounds which I can blend. Sound A, which is here, sound B, which is here, and then our blend dial, which kind of acts as a crossfader. So effectively I'm in a position to decide how much of the level I want from each sound. And of course, if I just hard pan it either to A or B, I'm only going to hear that one sound by itself. So what we've effectively got is an opportunity to choose the sound we want to use from a relatively limited list. And then what we can do is obviously if we want to create a transposition offset as well. So if I start with this 3 violin sound, okay, what we've effectively got is this kind of immediately quite a vintagey sound. And if I wanted to, without changing the transposition on my keyboard, I can come down an octave if I want to. And the reason that's handy is it means obviously I could create a kind of octave wide effect across 2 separate sounds. So if I wanted to blend the violins with a bit of this boys choir, I can do that. So I've got a chance to sort of create this big, rich, thick sound. Okay, I've got some other controls. I've obviously got a volume control, that speaks for itself. But what I've also got is a tape speed control, and this is actually really interesting. So if you imagine recording to tape, and if you imagine that tape moving really quickly, effectively the audio resolution when we played back the sounds that we had recorded would be higher fidelity than if the tape speed was slow. Effectively, it's kind of like the tape equivalent of digital audio resolution. And the same thing can be sort of approximated here. So if I take a sound like this and I slow the tape speed down, we get a much older, more kind of what we have referred to as kind of wow and flutter kind of tape effect thing, where we get a little bit of pitch modulation coming in. If I hold this chord down, you'll hear it's just much less stable. So we get this really nice kind of lo-fi effect over here and something a little bit more sort of hi-fi, I suppose, when we come around to the right-hand side. And as well as that, we've got a separate tone control. So if I bring this back to the middle for a moment, effectively this acts as a filter, getting rid of frequency content and either making the sound very bright or much duller. So I can have something really fizzy if I want, or something which is much more contained. So what can we actually do with the Mellotron? Well, I'm going to not risk a sort of copyright infringement, but if you want to experiment with the flute sound, you might enjoy that. you know how that goes. So anyway, we've got this idea of being able to sort of play around with blends of instruments, and certainly we can experiment with different sounds. But the reason why I'm drawn to the Mellotron to work alongside this kind of hip hop sort of vibe that I've got going on in the Birdland Calls kit is because lots of hip hop and lots of music is made where people are sort of looking for samples, little moments of kind of vintage flavor, I guess. So these kind of little lo-fi pianos that exist within this kit are kind of there to provide just little momentary snapshots. And in addition to just sort of using versions of that which exist within kits, or going looking for samples online, or finding samples wherever you find samples, we can make sounds of our own that sort of fulfill the same function. And what I'm interested to do is to see whether or not what we might do would be to see if we can make something that sounds a bit sort of silver screeny from a strings point of view and do something interesting with it. So I'm going to start with the 3 violins over here. I'm going to come back to 0 as my transposition, so the sound's right in the middle. And what I'm going to do over here is to select another kind of string effect, which is a full string section. And then what we'll do is set a balance between the two things. Okay, so it's just starting to get something that sounds, yeah, pretty retro. Okay, now what I need to do first of all is to find out what key I'm working in here with these Birdland Calls samples. Again, I haven't tuned any of those, so they're just literally coming out of Drum Machine Designer at whatever key they're in, so I need to figure that out. Okay, so we're kind of in G. I've literally just played down the scale until I found a note that felt like it was right. And so now what I can do is to start thinking a little bit, okay, well, what do I want this part to do? And I kind of want this slightly lushy, paddy thing, I guess. Yeah, let's try something like that. Okay, now what I'm going to do is actually just quantize those. Let's have a listen again. Okay, I like that. Now, what I want to do, obviously it's too loud, I'm going to leave it at this volume for now. But what I want to do is take it kind of even further into, I might have sampled this little string moment from a record, into that sort of territory. So a couple of things I'm going to experiment with. Firstly, what I want to do is to add some tape delay. Now, tape delay is obviously within the main delay folder, so if it's not in your most recent list, come down to delay and you'll find the tape delay version. And because my channel, because the Mellotron is mono, therefore the channel is mono, what I'm going to find is that the default option here is to work with the tape delay in mono, which is fine. That's exactly what I want. I want this idea of the sound having been recorded in mono. And in particular, what I'm going to do is I'm going to restrict the frequency content of the echoes that I'm going to get from the tape delay. Remember, delay and echo mean the same thing. We're going to end up with a signal which repeats. And I can control those repeats in terms of how fast they are by selecting a different note value here if I want to, or simply by moving the delay time around. And I can control how many echoes I hear by changing the feedback level. So if I turn the feedback level up, I'm going to end up with more echoes than if I turn it down. But what I can also do is to experiment with a diffuse tape head. Now what this does is still give me echo, but those echoes are going to be a bit more washed out and a little bit more like reverb. So rather than the kind of clean, delineated delays that we tend to get when we're working with the clean tape head, the diffuse one is just going to give me something which is just a little bit warmer and a bit more spread out. I'm going to restrict the frequency content even more so I get a kind of more mid-rangey effect and not as much treble. That's nice. So suddenly we're not getting all of the top end of the sound. And what I can also do, I mentioned sort of wow and flutter a little while ago. What I can do again, because this is tape again, just like the Mellotron relies on tape for its recordings, we're relying on a kind of tape-based effect here for our tape delay, is I can introduce some flutter, the speed of it here, and then the amount of it here. And what this is going to do is to give me little sort of pitch warps on the way that these sounds are going to echo. So we're going to get little variations in pitch as the echoes come back. Just hear it detuning a little bit. If I turn that up a little bit more, and in fact, just for a moment, I'll make it a bit brighter. You hear those little flutters. And the great thing is that because it's random, it's going to be different every time, just like it would be on tape. So I can bring that down a little bit if I want to, slightly increase the feedback amount. Let's just see how that fits now within the sort of track. It's still going to be a bit loud, I think. Okay, that's getting somewhere. It is definitely still too loud, but we can settle that in a little while. Now, the other effect that I mentioned wanting to experiment with as well, just again, to just slightly mess the signal up and make it feel a little bit more sort of vintage, is that I'm actually going to add a little bit of distortion. Now, Logic's got lots of different distortions, and somewhat anachronistically, going to use that word, it's posh, isn't it? I'm going to use bit crushing. Now, bit crushing is actually a kind of digital way of making sounds a bit more lo-fi. So effectively, this kind of echoes early sort of digital circuits. This comes back to kind of one of the main rules of record production, which is you can break the rules. So the idea of having a kind of digital, almost 80s style distortion effect before a kind of 60s treatment, well, fine, do it, try it, see what happens. So I'm going to experiment with that idea. I'm going to bring the bit crusher in. I'm not going to go crazy here. What I want to do is just take resolution down to, I don't know, somewhere probably between 10 and 12 bit maybe. And we're just going to see what happens when we rough the signal up. Now, to start with, this is actually going to make the signal even louder. There's a drive circuit here, which is just going to slightly turn the level up because it's pushing sort of the input level into this particular effect. And I just want to make it a little bit more sort of woolly. So I'm going to just run it twice. I'll solo this sound, so we're hearing it without the bit crusher. The delay is still in channel, you can see that down here. And then the second time round, I'll punch it in and we'll see what effect we're getting. So this is just delay to start with. Okay, so we get this little bit of white noise almost on each one, and I like that. So what we got with the Mellotron, the original Mellotron, was that there was a kind of sort of mechanical sound of tapes being set in motion and sort of recovering when a key was let go of. And obviously we're not getting any of that with the sort of vintage Mellotron sort of plugin. And whilst this is by no means an equivalent, I like the fact that we've just made it a little bit noisier, if you like. So I could go further by dropping resolution or increasing downsampling, but I'm going to leave those for now. All I want to do now is just kind of get a level for this so it just feels a little bit more in spirit with the rest of the track. This is an element rather than something which I'm kind of wanting to have run the show. So I'm going to drop the level, I don't know, 9 dB or so, and let's just see what that gives us. So it's really sort of interesting experimenting with the tape speed and with the tone dial as well, just to experiment with different flavors. Now, to me, this feels a little bit kind of Goldfrapp-y. I really like this idea of something that's just really sort of washed out. It's probably still too loud, but nevertheless, just something that kind of feels like a texture. And if I wanted this to feel even more like a sample, well, I could bounce it in place. I could turn it into a piece of audio and actually trigger it maybe in the same way that the drum machine designer samples are being triggered, so that effectively I only have the kind of restriction that we work with when we work with samples that have been sort of just grabbed in that way and triggered as samples can be. So within this video, we've looked at vintage Mellotron. We've discovered that there aren't a lot of parameters for us to play with, but nevertheless, what's there allows us to sort of build a really kind of retro series of tones and textures for our tracks.